I think if Rolling Stone had stayed in San Francisco, then something might have been possible. They would have been hard pressed to ignore everything forever.
Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast, a series of interviews with musicians, writers, artists, and other creative figures on topics relevant to the book Who Cares Anyway? Post-Punk San Francisco and the End of the Analog Age, coming in March 2023 on Headpress Books. That's headpress.com and whocaresanyway.online. I am Will York, the author of said book, and my guest on this first episode is Joe Carducci. In his lengthy career in and around music, Mr. Carducci has worn many hats, from record dealer and distributor and producer to writer, both of screenplays and nonfiction, including Rock and the Pop Narcotic and Enter Naomi, SST LA and All That, a book that winds through a lot of the same territory that this interview does. Now, both Enter Naomi and Rock and the Pop Narcotic, along with several other books by Mr. Carducci, can be purchased online through Night Heron Books and Coffee House. I'll put the address in the show notes, but it's Night Heron, HERON.square.site, SITE. Now, this interview is on the longer side in terms of what I'll be presenting. It's almost 2 hours, but there was so much interesting history and so many interesting mini digressions that I found it difficult to cut more than I already cut. We talked for, a little bit more than 3 hours, so there were some already painful cuts. But again, this one is a little bit long. Hope you enjoy it. New episodes should be coming on a more or less weekly basis for the next couple of months. This podcast is not going to go on forever. The idea is roughly a dozen episodes, but stay tuned and we'll see how it evolves. I think most listeners would probably know you best through SST and Rock and the Pop Narcotic. But before moving to Southern California, you spent some time in San Francisco, and then before that, Portland. And then I'm not actually sure where you were before Portland, but can you take us through that era, late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I tried, I was expected to go to college, so I tried it. And I went to University of Denver for a year and a half. Then moved back to Chicago, earned some money, and then moved to Hollywood. So I was actually in Hollywood from fall 76 till fall 77. And I was not in Hollywood for music, although I did buy the first issue of Slash magazine and, heard the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. I was actually, the only gigs I went to were Tangerine Dream, because you couldn't see Tangerine Dream a few years earlier when you were, really into their records. I was disappointed in their shows, but I certainly wanted to see them. I moved up to Portland, in fall 77. And that's really where I got into the record business per se.
Okay, and was Renaissance Records, I couldn't quite figure out, did that exist before you moved up there, or did you start that?
No, that was three guys who had worked at Music Millennium in the mid-70s, and they left to form. They basically wanted to get rid of all the boring records and just carry imports. And so Renaissance Records was their idea of, just having the cool stuff from Europe and, some classical, but basically it was German psychedelia and I guess you would say British imports and Japanese pressings, a little bit of audiophile. People would pay extra to have a German mastering, a German pressing, et cetera, like that. And they were doing that, and it was failing. So they were, but one of their partners had gone to London, probably for his own purposes, but on the lookout as part of this record store, he wandered into rough trade, when they were new, and this is probably in '77, and they were basically a reggae shop. They hadn't been turned into an independent label nexus yet. But the last of the three partners cultivated that connection because he was very into reggae, so he went over there himself. And at that point, they were getting into distribution of stuff and releasing their first records. And so that guy, Peter, got interested in whether you could do that over here. And you couldn't do it the same way. But London is the center of England and Great Britain, and and they had stuff from Manchester and Ireland, and all this stuff because everybody read The Enemy and Sounds and The Melody Maker, and over here nothing was centralized at all, and Portland was the last place you'd expect rough trade to settle on. These guys are our representatives in America. They had been shipping orders to the better stores, like Drome was in Cleveland and Bleecker Bob's in New York and Aquarius in San Francisco. But people didn't pay on time, and so they decided they couldn't afford to do that. They were so busy in England, so they liked Peter, and they bonded over reggae and marijuana and whatever else they were into. I was more interested in the actual punk rock music, I think, than any of them. They were interested in a lot of different stuff, but they tended to avoid the stuff that was really going to make things happen, which was, basically, punk rock, rock-based, hard rock-based punk rock, which, basically became hardcore and, everything that came out of SST finally. But yeah, I would say, by spring of '78, I was working for records at Renaissance, and it was down to Peter and I, and we were cultivating rough trade and our mail order sales and trying to interest shops around the country.
So it was a record store and kind of a distributor at the same time?
Well, it became a distributor mail order at the expense of a record store because we really didn't have much walk-in sales. We had some, but it was failing on that level. So we eventually gave up the shop and had an office space that was off the street level downtown, and we would only be open Saturday afternoons for walk-in shoppers, and that was probably for the last 6 months of 1979. We were doing it that way because our day-to-day work was all taking orders around the country, shipping out the records to those shops, and filling the mail order orders that came in. And we would buy a few things for the mail order, on major labels. Most of the punk rock in England at first came out on major labels, so Rough Trade didn't really distribute the Buzzcocks on UA or the Cure on wherever they were. Clash 45, stuff like that. But we might order 5 or 10s of those kind of things just for the mail order, because people around the country couldn't find those records, especially the 7-inch records. Record stores weren't. There was maybe one shop in every city that bothered to carry that stuff. So the business just went that way. We were involved locally. We brought the Dead Kennedys up as just, we were dealing with their first single, so they asked us for a gig, and we were able to set up a gig, actually an all ages show and a 21 show at a theater bar, and that did well. And then we brought Perubu into town, and that didn't do well. But they were going to be on Rough Trade, so Peter wanted to see them, and he was, they wouldn't have played Portland otherwise. So we put on their show. The local scene, was getting going, and they didn't trust us. Maybe I would say they didn't trust Peter, but I never. I was kind of a hippie-looking guy too, and so. But they didn't want to do business. They wanted artists to control the art. So the Alternative Arts Association was their, they had different venues, and they put on shows. And, this is the Wipers and King Bee and the Neo Boys. And even though the Neo Boys practiced at the record store, Renaissance Records, and Jennifer worked at Renaissance for a while, and she was the original guitar player, and she did some writing and stuff. And I had a radio show on KBOO, and Jennifer took over my radio show when I left, when we moved Renaissance down to Berkeley, so that in January 80, we opened up as Systematic, and we didn't do retail, in over-the-counter retail. We just had a warehouse, and we did the mail order, and and really got going at that point. We were a little bit. It was the wrong place to move to, but it was, in a way, it was more central than Portland was.
Was there any connection, formally or otherwise, with Subterranean at that point?
Well, we were probably the only distributor interested in a label like Subterranean. They had just started basically, and Steve Tupper would come by with the records as we needed them. He had been part of New Youth, the Club for the Deaf, which was kind of a political group of people who, they resisted Dirksen and, the businesses that were going. But they were set up good. They had a recording studio and the label, and they just kept doing stuff. And so I think eventually he had distribution through Rough Trade and Dutch East maybe, and on Flipper he probably could sell to other Important and Green World and Gem and other people. But at the beginning, I don't think anyone was interested in Subterranean. But we could we listened to records. I mean, it's hard to believe, but nobody really listened to the stuff. They got the buzz, and so they listened to Joy Division, and they got the buzz, so they listened to Birthday Party, but they really didn't listen to stuff that had no buzz, no press in England. There's hardly any press in America, but Slash or Flipside could generate some interest. But in general, in general, Systematic had myself and later Joe Pope, and Joe was in the band Angst, and he's like me. He didn't want to sell something if it wasn't any good, and he didn't want to sell it or try to sell it if he hadn't heard it. So, we knew what we were saying. We could tell a different record accounts. Well, you definitely want this one. You want a few of these. You want a lot of them. We had an informed opinion, whereas Gem and Green World and Important, I think Dutch East was pretty good. It's just the owner of Dutch East was a problem for Gerard Cosley, probably not paying to keep things in stock, and then starting a label and not really, nobody was capitalized, and nobody really knew what they were doing, and there was no media. There was no media to really do anything. So in the end, I mean, one of the things that's sent me to SST was that Black Flag was touring. And, if you were going to hang around the record business, that was the only thing that was going to ever change anything, is if you could tour.
Right, right. And speaking of new youth and Renaissance, there were, a few people who went back and forth a little bit between San Francisco and Portland. And a couple of those you mentioned in a paragraph that caught my eye about Diane and then Bruce from Flipper, and Diane being also known as Diane, and Bruce's girlfriend. But what do you remember about them?
Well, she I think Peter knew Diane before I did, so she'd been in Portland, and probably, she might have bought a few early records, and she was definitely, a serious person, very interesting, girl, and she was little, but very serious, and she had a brother who was interested in music, and but yeah, there wasn't much to do in Portland, so she went down to San Francisco, and Raz Rezabek, I think, was from Portland.
Right.
He went down there, and there was another another woman. She didn't come back, so I don't recall. She was a drummer for the Products. There was a band called the Products for a while, and she was, this is a third person who moved down to San Francisco. And I think Ava Lake was an artist. She moved down there. She was a buyer at Aquarius for a while. So, yeah, it seemed like you could get up to Seattle easier, but there was less going on up there. Although there were bands, we saw the Mentors and the Lewd from up there, and DOA came down from Vancouver, and I went up there because a vehicle was going up there to see when the Wipers first played outside of Portland. It was in Seattle, so some people went up there for the night, and that's when I first saw DOA. Was up in Seattle, I believe, and and the Wipers were great. I mean, right off the bat, they'd already been a band, I think, so they had maybe given up and then restarted when, the first kind of signs of a scene. I first met them at the Television gig. Television played the Earth Tavern for their second album, Adventure. So that might have been late '78 or early '79, and Greg Sage was just sitting at a table with probably Mark Sten and Tom Robinson, and some of the people from up there who were involved in a lot of gig productions and in different bands and stuff.
And then speaking of Ross, so you mentioned in the Sleepers, Painless Nights reissue, the liner notes to that he was the one who kind of encouraged you to listen to the Sleepers record, or I'm not sure encouraged it. You mentioned that it was the only thing he ever bought.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, kids in the scene didn't really buy records. I mean, it's like you kind of dropped out of watching television and watching sports if you followed sports a few years earlier. And, record collection didn't mean much. I mean, people wanted to probably have Raw Power and the first Ramones album and the Sex Pistols album, but, nobody was really paying a lot of attention to, collecting because, you just didn't have the money to do that. But he really was amazed to see it on the wall, the sleeve, and I'd already heard it, but first listen is never enough, and often stuff that is deeper, in its quality it takes a long time to, in a sense, you have to master it as a listener, and so when I saw him react to it, then I put it on again, and then he came back the next day and was telling somebody about the record, and I overheard him say that he and his girlfriend had listened to it all day long. and it is that kind of record, but you don't get that on your first exposure to it. So anyway, that it is strange how few records we sold. There were some people who had jobs, and they were straighter people, and they bought records, and they might go to see the bands, because the Wipers and the Neil Boys really did kind of, draw significant attention to their gigs, by the time you're talking 1979, especially, and so yeah, but it's hard to know, because even when you went down to Aquarius in San Francisco or Vinyl Fetish in LA, you'd in a way, people hung out at record stores, but they didn't actually buy a lot of stuff. It was all expensive, and you'd stay in the store and you'd listen to it. And in Renaissance, I mean, I had nothing else to do but talk to Bruce Luce, and so I would just play anything he wanted to hear and tell him what I thought was, the good stuff. And he was an interesting guy, and he kind of put the locals on edge because, he knew he was already in Flipper, even though they weren't necessarily, I don't know if they'd played yet, even in San Francisco.
He was up in Portland during the stretch where Ricky was singing with them. And so it was kind of like a musical chairs scenario where Bruce had rehearsed with them for a month or so, gone up to Portland. Ricky kind of slid into that role. It took me a while to sort that out because memories are quite hazy, and there's not a lot of documentation, but there's enough that you can kind of piece it together. But yeah, it was that year of '79 when everything was kind of sorting itself out as far as who would end up where going forward.
Yeah, they played very small bars. When I then got down there in January '80 in Berkeley, we were first in Pinole, actually. Then we found our space and moved in, and I got an apartment in Berkeley. So I first saw Flipper, I think, at the Dewdrop Inn on San Pablo in Berkeley. And then I decided to buy a cassette recorder because, I liked the show, but I couldn't remember anything about what they played. So I started taping their shows and basically taping anything that I went to, but it was basically to tape Flipper that I bought the machine, and I saw them at the Sound of Music, and then in a year they were playing the 10th Street Hall or People's Temple or whatever those big halls were. And they after the first single came out and the album, then they were a headliner, or a very strong support for Dead Kennedys or Black Flag or Throbbing Gristle or stuff like that. Public Image, I think. Yeah.
When the new Sleepers lineup came out with the second guitarist and the new drummer and bass player, you mentioned seeing them with Cabaret Voltaire and Young Marble Giants, and I think that was a 10th Street Hall
show.
Yeah. What do you remember about that? Yeah.
Well, that was not like the People's Temple, whatever, there were 2 or 3 halls next to each other. Those were deep, long halls with the stage at the far end from the front door. 10th Street seemed like a wide, left to right kind of a hall where, the stage was on the long side facing across a shorter distance. And, and they just commanded the stage. I mean, they really were, the Rough Trade was using a couple guys as lead advance men in San Francisco, Vale from Search and Destroy, and Craig, I forget his last name, but he was more of a straight guy who, we were forwarding the promos to the Americans on the Rough Trade list, and Craig and Vale would get multiple copies, and they would pass them around to, in Vale's case, press people, and in Craig's case, radio people in San Francisco. And Vale was involved in Adolescent Records, which did the Sleepers album and some other stuff.
Yeah.
And Vale had a partner who probably really did the record business stuff of coming, delivering the records to Systematic for distribution and stuff. And I didn't have a clear sense of the Sleepers. I knew I liked the EP, but I wasn't privy to the record and the band and what had gone into making that record. When it came out, I was a little, I liked it, but I suspected that the production was influenced by the British, factory stuff. And that really hit you when you saw what they did live, because that was way more powerful than, a Joy Division show could ever be, because it just connected rock and roll dots, dotted the I's, crossed the T's in a way Americans do, because Americans practice and they jam and, they do music differently. The British, got conceptual probably after the blues rock, in the 60s. They just didn't play. They didn't practice. So in the end, they're all playing keyboards and electronic stuff, it's hip hop in its own way. It's a studio music. So anyway, that's what when you saw the Sleepers, that's what impressed you is, wow, this is a big wide stage. It's a big wide hall, and and their sound is huge. I mean, should have but like I said, I didn't know much about Ricky, so I didn't know. Wow, it was amazing to see him do a whole set. I didn't know how rare that was.
Right.
That he was going to be able to function, and I didn't know if the band, reading Michael Belfer's book is just, it gives you all of that information. What they all went through to try to have it together.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's too bad. I mean, there's one recording, the Savoy show from early 1981, and that was kind of like the closing of the Savoy Tivoli. Somebody has made that one available online, and but I imagine you were going to the Savoy probably a lot. That was probably pretty close to the Rough Trade location.
I didn't see. Yeah, I think I was there to see Monitor, but I could be wrong. I don't have a tape, so. But I believe I went there. But sometimes you just first time you saw a band, you didn't and I did see bands before that I don't have tapes of. So, the tapes help your memory in a way that, you can't always tell. But, like early bands I saw in San Francisco, I remember seeing X and the Alley Cats at probably those halls over where People's Temple was. What was the other one called? It was the Bill Graham.
The old Fillmore was down there, and I think they might have brought it back in the early '80s. Or the Elite Club. I think it was called the Elite Club.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. That's on a few of my tapes of Flipper and Fang, and Minimal Man played there, I think. And I did go to the Elite Club regularly, and
I think they were either calling it the Temple Beautiful or the 1839 Geary, but they're all in that stretch, and the actual People's Temple was next door, I believe, to the place that they called the Temple Beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like San Francisco is maybe a great place if you can find a place in it. It's a nice scaled city, but there were no pressing plants. We what did we do? We cut we mastered the Birthday Party and the SPK album at Fantasy Records, and you're going into Fantasy's, a big record label distributor, and straight as an arrow, and you go to George Horn to cut lacquers because, at least you can control that. You don't have to send them tape out somewhere else, but after you have to send your lacquers to LA or somewhere to press, but you'd see Neil Schon walk down the hallway, and you're bringing in an SPK album, and there's just there's no way to communicate anything really. And eventually, I didn't know that Rough Trade should have moved to LA. Their idea was, we don't want to live in LA. Mayo Thompson was talking up Houston or San Francisco. That was what they wanted to do. But, I think if Rolling Stone had stayed in San Francisco, then something might have been possible. They would have been hard pressed to ignore everything forever. But once they left, there's really no way to communicate out of San Francisco, it wasn't my case was to get good music on the radio again, like I remembered it as a kid. That wasn't everyone's motivation. Most people were happy to be underground, and and to just be part of the scene that is what they wanted to do, which is I want to be hipper than these schmucks I went to high school with. And that's all they cared about. They didn't care about, well, the band can't afford to do, to buy strings for the guitar or something. That wasn't part of their thinking. And that's why, that they had a limited use for buying records and it took quite a while for, it seemed like it was high school kids who really needed to buy records when it came down to it. They wanted to buy the Black Flag record, then they wanted to buy the Minor Threat and the Adolescents and the Circle Jerks, and they bought the record. So suddenly you're selling hundreds of records where you really only sold hundreds of records when it was Joy Division or Young Marble Giants or Stiff Little Fingers, maybe, as far as rough trade type stuff went. Mostly you just sold 50 or 100, and we tried to keep things in print, but other distributors, keep things available in stock for reorders, and we would remind people of the best stuff that we thought they should sell more because it's better music. But most distributors it was slash and burn for them. If they got rid of their stock, they were happy and they didn't reorder.
Right. And, I think for a lot of us, we have to remember San Francisco in the early 80s was not anywhere near the kind of prominent place that it is now with, like Twitter being headquartered there. It's like it's a power center, but it really wasn't then, let alone a media kind of center.
Yeah. It's funny because in I guess it's first issue of Search and Destroy, the Sleepers are talking about, the computer industry in the garages of Palo Alto. And so they're aware of that because I don't know whose parents were, in academia or something, but they were kind of aware of things were all going to be changed, but, no one could imagine almost, you can't imagine the death of vinyl or the rebirth of vinyl. And, it's just too strange. And I was always interested in radio. If Black Flag hadn't taken me up on my offer to run their office for them, I was, I had written letters to Gem and to Perez Saraband label, maybe Green World even, trying to see if there was a job I could just slide into and get back to LA, so that I could basically continue screenwriting and try to not give up on that. Otherwise, I was probably going to move back to Chicago and just see what was going on there. But at SST, then, it was a deeper involvement because there's 6 or 12 or 20 bands, and you're involved every step of the way from practice gigs to records and whereas at Systematic and Renaissance, I was just dealing with the end product, which is how many records can we sell of this. You really, even though I know that music for those 4 years at Systematic and Renaissance, I know what came out really well, and I have most of it, but I don't have everything. But if because Systematic was so underground, we were getting known, but every band and every town that put a record together, they'd ask their record store, where to where do we take our record? Where do we send it? You know, it wasn't clear to people in those days. Oh, you send it to Systematic, and you send it to Green World, and you send it to Dutch East. I mean, all that stuff was, you know, just starting. And so you're liable to be ignored as, you know, as paid attention to, because I don't know, in a lot of ways, I've always thought people were handicapping cool instead of listening to music. And that's somewhat inevitable, but you really have to work to listen, you know, with open ears to new stuff that's coming out. Otherwise, you're just like these people who were, you know, they would just flip from, you know, goth to industrial to, you know, the next cool, and you wondered what they did with their old records, you know,
Right.
eventually just molting their collection over and over again, I guess.
Right, right, and you know, so when you moved to Southern California, that you were alluding to that just now, that there was a specific reason, but I'm also kind of wondering, because going back through the San Francisco chapter in Simon Reynolds' "Rip It Up and Start Again," which you know, I found very, very helpful when I was getting started, and I love that book, but he definitely focuses more on the theatrical electronic side of things. He uses the word cabaret, and you know, he does, of course, interview you, and there is stuff about like Flipper and Chrome and stuff, but different emphasis than certainly like what you would later go on to write about in terms of like an actual rock aesthetic. But was that something when you were in San Francisco, were you seeing a more prevalence of kind of bands that you were less interested in? And was that something else that was kind of wanting you to kind of move on and find another place that felt more like home musically?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I always was interested in a lot of different stuff, but I never stopped liking hard rock, you know, in the sense that maybe other people turn the page on Black Sabbath or, you know, whatever they were into, even the Stooges, you know, people, you know, Vale, I asked Vale one time if he was going to see the Ramones. They were playing on campus at UC Berkeley, and he said, no, it's the same old movie, you know. And I, you know, to me, I love movies. Music is not a movie. I mean, it's. I don't care how samey you are. It's, you know, the kinetic. What do you call it? Audiokinesis of a live band. But you know, I don't think Simon Reynolds listens to music that way either. You know, I mean.
Right.
I saw Tuxedo Moon. I thought Tuxedo Moon and Chrome are in a way they have the strangest sense of acoustics of anyone who did a lot of records, you know. And, you know, obviously Chrome is a little more rock occasionally. I mean, I like them when they're really rocking instead of, you know, spacing out and stuff. But I liked some of Tuxedo Moon. I went and saw Aldo Ray was a one-off, I think. I saw one show of theirs in a sit-down theater. You could kind of tell that the Sophistos wanted, they thought there would be more money, you know, if you could get away from these grubby teenagers, you know, and I didn't know enough about San Francisco to really understand that, yeah, these kids were all from the suburbs and they were embarrassing, you know, to anyone who thought, well, geez, I'd rather be in Paris or something, you know, or it's just not, that's not how I think of, certainly of music, but um, I mean, you respected people like Dirksen when once I was down in L.A., I would often go up with Black Flag if they were just going to play San Francisco or just go up the coast a little bit and come back to L.A. I could, take those 4 or 5 days and go with them. And so then, I don't know if it was probably they were playing the on Broadway, and so after Black Flag finishes, it's late and the loadout is complicated. I think they went down that back stairwell, which was really steep, and with these heavy amplifiers and everything. And so it's about 3 a.m, and you're in the van in front of the Mabuhay, waiting for the last bit of space out to end and everyone to get in the van and drive back to LA. And Dirk is, pushing a broom in front of the Mabuhay at 3 a.m. And so the band gets to say goodbye to him. And, you respected Greg and Chuck as adults who kind of didn't have this commercial phobia the way I was talking about Portland or, different art scenes where, artists didn't want to deal with businessmen. And, there's obvious reasons. There wasn't enough money around, so everyone thought they were being ripped off. Well, everyone except maybe Greg and Chuck. I mean, they were, they felt like, they wanted the promoter to be happy so they could come back and not have another fight on their hands over, it just wasn't going to work that way. So if you got shafted a little bit the first time, you would make yourself important to the promoter and they would treat you better as time went on. And, that kind of cold reasoning and self-interest was a smarter way to approach things back then, when the important thing was to get to where you could tour and get to where you could support your own art. Because everyone else was waiting for a dream, and that just didn't happen. And I mean, when it did happen, you could say, well, they didn't let it happen until the music was no longer good. You get to a point where the music form is worn down to even Nirvana, who were very good players, but Cobain was not improving as a guitar player. That just wasn't what he was going to do. And so there was no way that band was going to last very long. And you look at Dave Grohl, he's a great drummer, but you can't have a career from the drum kit. So he becomes, a mediocre guitarist and singer and somehow the career is there for him to step in. And, when the music was more vital, you couldn't have success. The industry, reacts in some ways. And so when you really have rock and roll going on, you're at a disadvantage in the recording studio, in a live concert hall, and in a record store, because, I don't know, people still argue about Spot's productions of SST. Well, that he was recording jazz bands, so he's showing you and delivering to the band how they sound, and it's idealized because it's balanced, and he's found an equalization for the different instruments so they're not all stepping on each other if he can. I mean, the problem for Black Flag is Damaged is songs written for one guitar played with two guitars, and Slip It In and My War are written for two guitars and they're played by one guitar. It's the fate. The fates of a rock band are doomed or cursed. Let's say cursed, because you manage to do it, but it's not ideal. You just. But what's ideal? The Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're from the industry, from radio. That's ideal.
Flipper and the Toiling Midgets, both of them, their debut LPs came out in 1982, and then it was a real struggle to get to the second record. And Flipper had gone fishing, which took a long time to come out, and Toiling Midgets, they had kind of already broken up. With Deadbeats, that must have been a tough one to put out, because they did not exist, and they were instrumental, and to the extent that people knew them from anything to do with Ricky Williams, he was long gone by that point. But how did you come to be involved with that one?
Well, I think John Bouchard was asked, if he was interested in doing it. He was, I'm not even sure who he was in touch with. I met Craig and, later Aaron. But the record just fell into, John's hands, really. I think they had hoped Rough Trade might be interested in it, but, that's the thing. I mean, you couldn't even Vail, probably tried, because I'm sure he believed that was important, anything Ricky was doing, or Belfer, or Craig Gray, or any of those guys,
yeah.
He would have vouched for, I'm sure. But you couldn't tell the English, anything about what was important. If you think about it, they're trying to sell this very English stuff. I mean, of those bands, the Fall made an impression over time. They really got their sound down, and really worked musically. It was a rock band. It really was, together. But most of the stuff was not. It was, on one hand, it was very English, but it wasn't together. It was style, and so. The first Toiling Midgets record was supposed to be on Rough Trade US.
Right.
And Situation 2, or whatever they call it, is really the Americans improvising how to get it out after they told the band, we'll do it.
Okay.
And they said, no, you can't do it. You can't put Rough Trade's name on it. Why? What are you protecting from Ricky? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, really. And where's Mayo, or where's Scott Peering, or there were some Americans over in the London office, but they didn't know San Francisco. They didn't know that the Sleepers were important. They probably listened to the Adolescent release, Painless Nights, and thought, they're copying Joy Division, or,
right.
They don't understand that, this is really still the Stooges that people are working from, the pre-Ramones template of rock and roll, which is really what Negative Trend and the Sleepers both were doing, which was Funhouse and Raw Power, basically. But that's that, I call it the Bowie syndrome, because David Bowie has a new look and a new name and a new record, and he's not wearing out or deepening what he's doing. He's turned a page. He's doing something new.
Right.
And that's not a musical evolution. It's style and modernism, gay pageantry. There's a lot of traditions of that. And they tend to be anti-rock. And so to an extent, if you're me, that makes you underline the rock continuity. And all of that was there. It's just some people weren't paying any attention to it. It's like in the middle of punk rock, Ray Campy puts a band together and starts touring, with like a 6-piece rockabilly band, and they were great. They played the Earth Tavern in Portland, and they got a push from whoever. I don't know if it was Radar Records or somebody in London, and they toured America. And if they played Portland, they played a lot of places. I don't know if they left any, but you couldn't call rockabilly exhausted if you saw them play their set. And and Muddy Waters was still around. I saw him in Portland, and Big Walter, and the blues was still accessible. And if you were my age, you were trying to make up for not knowing, what happened in the 50s and 60s. And these guys still alive, you wanted to check them out when you could. And but so that's why that Bowie thing doesn't make sense. It's you think, well, this is I don't know what it is, theater, showbiz. It's not really rock and roll. And in the 70s, you saw progressive rock was a dead end, with Emerson, Lake and Palmer and all, whatnot. It just there were different reactions to that. So Robert Fripp was a kind of conceptual response. Punk rock was too, but it was also natural because they really couldn't play, scales or whatever time signature arrangements you were maybe listening for in '74 because you wanted to hear something new. But and then someone like Hendrix dies and that's a dead end. So you don't see necessarily an organic fulfillment of what you think of as going on. It stops. And sometimes it stops very fast. And, it's great that the literature is catching up to the history because you really didn't know what happened in the old days, between Mercury Records and the New York Dolls, or, it was kind of impenetrable. The Rolling Stone, the publishers really used to only care about Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and maybe Sun Records. You'd get documentation released in a paperback book of, recording session log books. You could find that on Sun Records. You could find it on the Beatles, Bob Dylan, nothing else. If you were interested in Uriah Heep, you were up Schitt's Creek. You weren't going to find out anything about their records at all. One of my favorite quotes is, in Rock and the Pop Narcotic is one of those New York record label guys. Maybe he was in L.A., but he said you could take 3 guys out of Uriah Heep and replace him with 3 other guys, and it doesn't matter a whole hell of a lot. He's thinking like they're supposed to be the Beatles too, where you ask the girls, do you like Ringo or do you like Paul? It's not like that, 10 years later. So but anyway, the like I said, the literature is improving. These books, you've been involved with and that are coming out, are, full of great stuff like the Avengers book on Wilsey and Chris, what's his name?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Chris Isaac. Yeah. The Goldberg book. That I didn't think I would read into the Chris Isaac section, but it is very interesting. I mean, it is. I didn't know Isaac except for the hit song, but I knew that the Avengers. That the guitarist had been in the Avengers. He actually played bass, I guess, in the Avengers. But, I mean, it's a sad story, but they're all sad stories.
Yeah, and I'm glad that one came out because I did not focus on the Avengers. I really, of the late 70s bands, I focused on the Sleepers and Negative Trend, but mostly for continuity. Well, I like their music, but there's also a continuity in terms of the connecting into the 80s.
They weren't. They were. I mean, I did a a book talk at whatever Superior Viaduct bookstore was in Oakland, and Penelope referred to her band, and I didn't recognize her, so I said, "What was your band name?" And she goes, "The Avengers." And I go, "Oh," because they were a band you wanted to see live, but they were not a band. They weren't together anymore. Right. By the time we get down to Berkeley, it's January '80, and they're gone. But their EP comes out later that year, I think, the 12-inch, and we had been selling the Danger House 7-inch. Really well. I mean, it was the one Danger House record that the Nash hardcore kids got into, and Danger House was. I mean, Jennifer had been a buyer at a record store called Longhair in Portland. And I went in there, and she had stuff in there that we didn't have at Renaissance. And the most important was she had like all 5 of the Danger House 45s for sale, and they really didn't have many quantities because they were just buying, for their own, for their own interest really, and to tell people, hey, you should buy that. But that was new to me. And they were obviously the best label going on, and so I immediately took down the address and ordered those and added those to what we were distributing, and even the Dills single is just a classic, and the Randoms and the Avengers. And the Alley Cat, I mean, that stuff is powerful. And it was, just you couldn't do much, distributing those records. And until you got to Jealous Again and the Adolescents and, the Avengers 12-inch, that at that point we start having to order by the hundreds. And it's piss poor to order 400 Adolescents records. But at the time, my partner said, "Hey, are you sure you're going to sell 400 Adolescents records?" I mean, you knew it was going to happen. They sent us a test pressing, so I knew the record was, good. And I'd never seen the band live, but, there was suddenly an audience, and that meant you were going to sell those 400 and reorder quite quickly. But yeah, radio was a problem, and but until you really have a person working radio at SST, we eventually had Ray Farrell, and he did a lot of work in San Francisco and Berkeley, at Rough Trade and CD and Subterranean and Rather Ripped. And when I finally talked him into coming down there, then at SST, he was calling up radio stations, and then we got a kind of an inside look at, just how fucked up radio was. I mean, media is, in a way, they prefer pop to rock. They just prefer a clean, machine-made product. And so, in a way, the only thing radical about hip-hop is the vocals. The way they put the music together is really what radio wants. They want just engineered sound, and they don't want expressive playing.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's just a conundrum that it was only solved for a very short period of time when Nirvana broke through, and then you had the Melvins on a major label for Dinosaur Jr., a couple records. The window opened a little bit the way it had been when I was in high school, in the early 70s. And if you weren't my age, you didn't remember when radio was good. Most of these hardcore kids, they were Ted Nugent fans or, Kiss fans or, they really didn't remember when radio was good.
This distinction between engineered sound and rock music is really that distinction is really the core of rock and the Pop Narcotic. But was there a certain time when that idea crystallized in your mind that was because a lot of people, when say punk comes along, lines were drawn in terms of punk, pre-punk, or but you don't make the distinction that way at all, because you see a continuity.
I mean, I probably did make the distinction at first, because there's a period in the mid and late 70s where you're tired of these Tasty Licks guys, and you're tired of of facility and flashiness in the old prog rock or acid rock, or so in a way, to the extent the early punk rockers were forcing the rhythm and playing all downstrokes and accentuating the harsh, almost the whiteness of the sound structure, getting away from the well-oiled funk, black rhythmic approach. What black players did coming out of, say, the church or dance bands, funk bands, was a kind of a stylistic promise of smoothness, elegance, and often when I was a kid, I would wonder, why do they have 8 people up on stage? Why is there 10 people on stage? They'd have a horn section and 3 chick singers and 3 guitar players, and they'd be doing the tiniest little chicken plucking, and they were trying to replicate a kind of a dream of sophisticated dance music, and as a white teenager, you're too impatient for that. But, when I saw the bands at SST work in practice so hard on how the drumming was arranged to fit into the bass, playing the melody and then the guitar coming in on top of it, you're kind of involved with musicians who are reconnecting to early 70s smoothness and facility. And so it's, when I'm working on Rockin' the Pop Narcotic, I'm going back to, Wes Bruce and Lang records and, all this stuff, and re-listening to things that I had worn out and I was no longer really interested in. And and then when you hear what they were doing at the top of their game, I think it's the song is called "The Doctor," and it's Jack Bruce on bass playing with Felix Pappalardi and Leslie West, and or no, it's Corky Lang on drums. They're just whipping that rhythm thing around. It isn't. I mean, it's blacker than white, but it's not something you hear black musicians do with that level of force, because their interest is more in subtlety. But these three guys were like exploring the kind of caveman rock, and what could you do with caveman rock. And so there's stuff on that record that is just light years beyond the rhythm section of anybody in punk rock, except the Minutemen, maybe. So you just recognize that and accept it, and you revalue it in your mind as you just get older and have heard more records, and you've seen the different styles kind of end because they were happy being styles instead of having the musicians in pursuit of something they were trying to master, and you're more musically involved as a band. And it's difficult because it's not every band has got the same potential with the players at hand. And I was often talk with Bill Stevenson and just listen to a Kira Rossler interview on the Mojack podcast, and the band, those two players could have done something like what John Wetton and Bill Bruford did with King Crimson. And Greg Ginn liked King Crimson, so why did he turn them into a metronome, instead of, letting them syncopate or letting them improvise? He just he demanded they get simpler, and this is in my head, and the later Black Flag albums. And sometimes when you listen to the live recordings, it works. And other times it's so simple in the rhythm section that it's kind of like the acoustics aren't there somehow, and it goes by you without having an impact. Of course, you're not there at the concert; you're listening on a laptop, so you're going to be lucky to find the recording that survives to give you a sense of that. But there are videos where you see that 4-piece and it's working as minimal as it got, other than Greg's solos. They got pretty minimal.
Yeah, but just the idea from what I've read about how much they would
practice, but even whether you want to call it practice, but just playing in a room together is almost is
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
lost art, and the idea that
Yeah.
that's just a completely
Yeah.
different
In that
genre.
sense, yeah. It's in a way it's wrong to call it minimal because it's so practiced that that's my best friend I met while I was in Portland was Dave Lightbourne, and he was in a completely different scene. He did a 50s rock and roll show on KBOO, which is how I got to do the punk rock show, and but he was in a jug band. He played guitar and he studied Charlie Patton and Tommy Johnson and Son House, and that's what he cared about. And we both worked at the Cinema 21 movie theater, which is how I met him. But I don't do drugs. I never smoked pot, and he would tell me that pot, speeds up your mind, which to you makes the music seem to slow down and allow you to place your note strike exactly on the rhythm you want it, an expressive positioning of the note on this side or that side of the rhythm, where you want it. And, but if you're sober and you're listening to these stoned cats on stage, often it's somnambulistic. It's too subtle for, you to, unless it's hard rock, it might go past you. And, but anyway, I often thought that my radio show really had no audience because it was just like 1 hour at 11 p.m. Sunday nights. But Jerry A. from Poison Idea said he was a listener to my show, and I think somebody else mentioned taping the show and listening to that hour of records. And again, that I didn't think the only records we ever sold, obviously from the radio show, was Two Boy Army. Before Gary Newman went solo, his band was called Two Boy Army, and I remember really liking that first record. He played a lot of guitar, unlike his later stuff. And we sold a bunch of those records out of the over the counter, which is pretty rare. But I didn't pay enough attention to David Lightbourne's knowledge of 20s blues, Delta blues, and jug band music. And that's the one weakness of Rock and the Pop Narcotic, is I didn't realize, and he didn't know to tell me, that the acoustic blues, once it got out of New Orleans, it wasn't about horns and pianos anymore, and the guitar and harmonica and washboard became the rhythm section, and I got a more of a crash course on that aspect once I was in Wyoming, and he was living in Laramie with me and playing his, we put a band together in Laramie, and we did a record at the Descendants studio, and of his music. I'm probably putting a record of his together for the Feeding Tube label, which also did my brother's 70s band. They had some practice tapes, so we put together an archival release of their stuff from 75. And that's as dumb as we were at Systematic and SST, we were classically suburban knuckleheads when my brother, who was younger than me and got really good on guitar, and they were very ambitious, in a Mahavishnu sort of way, playing instrumental, studying music theory and writing these elaborate, kind of hard rock instrumental prog jams. And so some of that's finally come out, and it's curious. I'm supposed to do vocals on tapes that Mike Watt and his drummer put together when I told him my brother was playing the guitar again. So he immediately, writes and records 8 rhythm tracks and sends the files to me to give to my brother to add guitar to. So they did it, and now I'm supposed to make my vocal debut on that. So I'm not in music anymore, but I'm still tied to it somehow.
What is the name of this outfit, or does it have a name yet?
Well, Watt started calling it Carducci Brothers.
Okay.
So we got to come up with a better name than that. But his 70s band was called Midnight, and named after the Hendrix instrumental, which is probably Hendrix's best song. It's an amazing thing off of War Heroes album. And but yeah, my brother's bass player, and back in the 70s, he's who brought in the Hawkwind records. And you thought, Jesus Christ! I mean, how have I never heard of this band? They've got 3 albums out already. And, that's how it was. You just didn't read about stuff in Rolling Stone magazine. Not sure they were in Circus or, whatever else was around. I started reading the British music weeklies at the Hollywood Public Library in 76. Once you figured out, wow, the Sex Pistols are into anarchy. That sounds pretty cool. And you start looking at those magazines, and they're still covering Tangerine Dream and all this European stuff too. So I would spend some time reading those, and I think I probably almost met people like Darby Crash and those guys who were doing that too at the library there. But I didn't run across any punk rockers really while I was in Hollywood that one year. But I did listen to K-Rock, and I did hear the stuff. The Dictators and the Ramones were on, and so yeah. I mean, I had remembered the radio from L.A. and I didn't do much talking to the rough trade people in London. I went over there and met them all, but Peter talked to them mostly, and I told Peter, hey, we should move to LA, not Berkeley. And Peter was a hippie. He didn't want to go to LA any more than they did. And I don't know. It's hard to believe we might have gone to Houston, but that's what they were talking like.
Well, a lot of people from Houston wound up moving up to the Vats or places like that in like 1982. But yeah. Yes, or other places in Texas.
Sluggo. Yeah, there was a fanzine called Sluggo, and I forget who made the fanzine, but I met him in San Francisco after he had moved, and he had his letterpress or whatever, one of these old-fashioned things, and he was gonna. I don't know what happened, if he ever did a publication or not. Because the stuff that came out were like Damage magazine and Vacation and Another Room.
Creep.
After Search and Destroy, Research.
Creep. Unfortunately, somebody scanned all the issues of Damage, and that was along with Slash, was a very valuable resource. Whereas with Creep, much harder to find. Although there was one issue that I was able to get my hands on, and it was amazing. I mean, it's got an interview with Flipper. It's got a whole story about New Youth. It's got a live review of the Sleepers playing with Factrix, and but so that was like 1980, but it was like that window in between punk and really like hardcore, and where there was was kind of undefined, and things were sorting themselves out. And you really, in terms of San Francisco, really sort of bifurcated between, or split between the hardcore stuff and other, and that kind of really took over.
Well, I quoted Will because Flipper were interviewed on Maximum Rock and Roll, and and Tim Yohannan really sort of changed into a hardcore, a priest almost. And then a band like Flipper or Angst would be challenged, like, what makes you hardcore, or why should people listen to slow music or jangly guitar, or whatever your crime was. He really I think he sold all of his 60s garage records. He really turned the page on the past and became just into hardcore. And he was interviewing Will, and Will said, well, we want to experiment with the music without being an art band. And that was his way of, to your question about the art bands in San Francisco, who, of them, for a while, Minimal Man really had a band, and he would play the Elite Club, and he had a great drummer, and, they worked.
Yep.
What they were doing worked in a rock hall.
Yeah. And
I'm not sure Tuxedo Moon, they had a band originally.
Very early.
But I'm not sure they worked better in a different kind of a situation. Right. Ultimately, and they left the country because Europe was better for them. Yeah. But yeah, there's a point at which that's a different kind of thing. That to my mind that belongs in movie soundtracks. It's not so much a performance music.
Right, and I think even they would tend to admit that the rock elements that were there in their music early on, that I think both you and I find to be the stuff that we would gravitate toward, is not what they were interested in, and again, they were, and so there was a time, say late 70s, where all of that stuff could sort of coexist, and it wasn't there wasn't the sharp distinction, and then you get into sort of the 82, and it didn't it didn't, and so then Flipper becomes this anomaly where they are at once part of, or at least associated with, the hardcore scene without really playing that kind of music at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising because of really probably their drug use that they really did become a touring band, and that was difficult to foresee. Steve Tupper was really interested in Flipper, and so he was going to do whatever they wanted to do, and somehow it worked. They were able to handle it on the road for years, and I'm glad, because you weren't sure other people were going to ever see this band that you'd go and see at this small club, and whereas with Black Flag, you knew they were going to be back, and the next time they wouldn't be playing this garage or whatever dump they were playing. They were going to be playing eventually the rock club that it's hard to you forget who was the bread and butter of these commercial venues at the time. The stuff on the 415 label or
right, yeah,
I don't know, some sort of half measure, sort of a punkish band, or on the East Coast there were a lot of these retro bands that were not really that good at pop music. I mean, the Smithereens were good at it. DMZ were good at it, but there was a lot of bands like that were 60s throwbacks sort of, and it just, I don't know who went to those gigs. Did they really pay off? They didn't really get on the radio. I mean, but, yeah, that's what I mean. You had all these guys sort of second guessing or trying to anticipate what was going to be popular. And they were wannabe managers, wannabe booking agents, wannabe program directors. And
that was the Howie Klein situation in San Francisco with 415, where there was just, it's like they were picking stuff that had something in common with this new music, but it was also to like, can this be polished or kind of sold, and will they behave and that sort of thing.
Well, Howie would have Black Flag on his radio show, and but yeah, there was. I don't think there was ever any interest. It's like he did not ask them because they had their own label. He wouldn't have thought that he wouldn't have thought there was any upside, I think. But really the upside would have been along the lines of getting to Metallica's audience before Metallica made that audience. And that wasn't of any interest in the new wave hip scene. They didn't really want those people.
Right.
Which the only guy who got him was Nirvana, and he didn't want him either. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I guess it's class structure, and we didn't think that way because LA is just a different sort of uncontrolled environment. You're just trying to get in front of people, and but it did happen even to those bands. Basically, the idea that, well, we don't want those people coming to the show, or this or that. It did the open-ended style that I tried to do in the buying at Systematic. You weren't perfect at it. You're doing this on the fly. You don't, you miss some records that you should have carried, and carry some you don't need to carry. And then at SST, the open-ended thing, where you're selling to a dozen distributors, that's extinct. Everyone is an exclusive deal now with somebody, and you just wonder that can't be better. An exclusive distributor, they don't even have to break the seal on a record to listen to it once. They don't. They just are moving shoes. It's. I don't know how they buy, or what they buy. It's just not an open system. So they just it's sort of gravitated to where people are doing 200 copies of records, new releases.
Right. Yeah. I was listening to something the other day where I think it was on that Rock Crit podcast, a different episode, where somebody was talking about the role of the rock critic being something that has almost gone obsolete relative to what it was. But what this conversation is sort of emphasizing to me is that there was this other role of the, like, in terms of a distributor or buyer, that was also like curating things in a sense. And it never really occurred to me that people deciding what records to stock, yes, they're not necessarily writing reviews, but their decisions are important, and that played a role. Yeah. We just, for those years, carrying the rough trade stuff and putting the American stuff, pulling it all together, like we eventually were carrying some of the New York stuff, but we missed, the television 45. We didn't distribute that.
We didn't distribute the Perubu singles. We missed, 76, 77, then we got going in 78. But it, you don't know what record stores around the country until you put them together, and that takes a year, takes 2 years, and it's still going on, when we're in Berkeley. So, we're adding new shops, trying to convince them they need to have a corner of the store for this stuff, that's coming. And, it might have been Minor Threat, it might have been the Misfits, it might have been the Cramps 45s. There were a lot of things coming out, and you could kind of catch hold of a shop because of something, the Feelies, bringing in their record from Rough Trade. You just didn't know what it was that would get them to do that. Slash, we distributed the magazine, but it was hard to sell magazines for us. We were shipping records out to shops, COD. They weren't likely to want to pay COD for a magazine, but eventually they figured out that Slash was, really a unique magazine. They did kind of a sample issue culled from other things, and then they gave us hundreds of them for free to just throw into boxes. And that was the kind of idea generation you had to do, to try to work your way around this blockade, which was unthinking, really. It wasn't a conspiracy. They didn't have to, do anything to ignore you. You barely had a voice. The San Francisco bands have written about it in particular were difficult. We couldn't buy any records from when we were in Portland. The San Francisco bands just did not have business on their mind. Even if they managed to get a record out, they weren't answering their mail.
Right.
If you got their address, you couldn't count on getting a response. The Dead Kennedys were the first band that really seemed like they, were going to do this seriously. And we should have been more active in planning out with them their next record and how we were going to do something worth touring behind, how to market a 12-inch record. We didn't do that, and we did their reissue of the first single. We put out Holiday in Cambodia for 3,000 copies, and then they sold it to IRS Records because, they just didn't think we were doing a good job, or it didn't have the visibility or whatever. I don't even know, because we sold 3,000 records. That was pretty good. Yeah. And we had another 2,000 ready to go. We had the covers done. But, we just didn't know. We didn't know what to do in those years. We didn't know if they were going to be able to tour everywhere they wanted to tour. And you didn't know how to do it, I thought with the Dead Kennedys, you could sell them on television late at night, by those kind of, by a kind of a joke ad. But I don't know if they would have run the ad
right.
With the band name. Probably not.
Right. And yeah.
But anyway, you had to find your way around the radio people.
Yeah. And they would have been, if I, from my vantage point, not having been there at the time, but what I've talked to people and read, they were the only one that I could compare. They were the only one of the San Francisco bands that I could compare to anything like a Black Flag as far as the work ethic or discipline. I mean, you could say a lot of things about Flipper or the, these other bands, but work ethic isn't the first thing that comes to mind. And
yeah, I mean, you're a little surprised, because why would you bother being in a band if you don't want to tour? But people did think you were going to get signed and then put on the road and put in hotels, put in a bus and put in hotels. And that got, I don't know who that happened for, but it barely happened for the Ramones. So, you had to be on a major label to get even that low rung going. And, or someone like Blue Oyster Cult, they had, every 4 years they had a radio hit. And they could just barely, survive on that. So, yeah, what chances did Flipper have, really? I mean, they got probably the most they could get. Whereas I think Black Flag had a better upside, but by the time the 5-piece band was by the time Dez quit, and he offered to stay to finish the recording, but Greg said, no, we'll just do, the 4-piece. And then My War became without Chuck even. That put a big dent in their the ability to put that record across, because those songs were killer for them. Even if they weren't playing them in their live set, they were playing them in sound checks and practicing. And the 5-piece was the band to make it happen across the country. But it didn't happen because of Unicorn, because of the, each additional player makes it complicated on tour, in the bus, and in the restaurant, in a pit stop, etc. It all gets tougher and tougher. And we weren't even really selling merchandise. So later on, there's T-shirts, and there's 2 crew or 3 crew, or then there's a PA. They took on everything, and probably. The time had passed where they were going to make a breakthrough that was going to happen in 82, and it didn't happen. So it was by 83 that Metallica had that audience, and they weren't going to move to punk rock until Nirvana eventually.
Right.
They just weren't going to accept it.
Right. Yeah. And then otherwise it was the path to sort of college rock or on the other side of things.
Yeah. And when you listen to stuff like late Husker Du on Warner Brothers, or Firehose, or late Meat Puppets, it's really disappointing. It's that those are bands trying to find their way to survive economically and get onto a major label, because the independent situations were drying up and failing. And it's sad, because that's not what the music was supposed to be delivering.
Right. Yeah, but I think there will continue to be an interest in this era, partly because of I don't know. I always hesitate because maybe I could be completely clueless to great things happening, but it just it seems like as time goes on that this tradition of people playing together in a room, playing music that kind of way is I grew up with it as being part of life, and now it's like, oh, this was something that kind of happened.
Yeah. It's kind of cultural. I thought even when the band era was still going, any band that started after 1981, assuming the kids are 20, then they would have been 10 in 71, and FM radio goes bad in 74. So, they're 13 years old. If you don't get into music before you're 13, you never hear great music on the radio. And so, what are you programmed? What is the music culture you matured into? It's just not rich. I mean, in my case, we sat through, the Count Basie Orchestra to see Rolling Stones on television. And, you heard all kinds of Stax singles on Top 40. Whether you wanted to or not, you got programmed by good stuff that even the stuff that was beyond your ability to, comprehend really and appreciate, made you a better listener 10, 20 years later. And that's what's missing. It's almost like, it's like a lobotomy, by omission. It's just not, good music is just not in you. The way you walk through the culture, and you didn't even search it out. Like I said, everyone went to record stores, and you're in there and you're looking at some grubby garage band, Greaseballs, but you're hearing the latest Sinatra over the record store PA, or whatever, the stuff that went into the pop culture overall. And that can't be duplicated by just collecting records or collecting iTunes, or picking out stuff to explore. That's all you can do, but it's inferior to what went on in the really, it's from the 20s into the early 70s, and it goes good and bad over time, but radio used to be a local business, and these behemoths own all the channels now, and it's kind of funny to see Taylor Swift, in a way channeling Pearl Jam circa 93 or whenever they tried to work without Ticketmaster.
Oh yeah.
It's just so much further along that her complaint is not the same one. Her complaint, I guess, is that they sold them, to scalpers instead of fans. But who knows? I mean, it's like you say, it's a foreign language now. Who's paying all this money to see pop music? $100, $200, $300. People go to these, Bonnaroo and those kind of things now, and it becomes almost a vacation of music. It doesn't interest me, but there's no doubt that, more music will appeal to you in a live environment, but I'm not sure the big concert productions are live environments exactly anymore. Too much digital control of the drums, of the PA, the programming, etc.
Yeah, and then in terms of recorded music, it's bittersweet. You have access to all this stuff that you can find it immediately, and to somebody somebody would ask, how could you possibly be nostalgic for an era where you had to special order something, or go across town to the record store and hope they had a copy? It's
well, I know, yeah. That's and you're writing a book today. I was, when I was writing the Naomi book, we wrote letters to each other. So
right, yeah.
She wrote letters all over the country, and And in a way, I couldn't write the book without that kind of, you know, asset. My own letters and her letters and various other people's letters, and you know, and that's all gone now. It's like email, and then you get rid of your phone, and do you have all that stuff? Can you search it all and put anything together that's equivalent to what the letters give you? I have my doubts. But yeah, it's nice that people are finding the stuff. You know, if young people are finding and relating. I mean, you write about someone like Naomi Peterson, or you read about Ricky Williams or Will Shatter. I mean, they're cautionary in part, but they're also inspiring. So, you don't want to encourage the wrong thing, but you do want to, let people know that, it might take a little more involvement to really produce something memorable, and the kind of the dilettante approach where you dabble in 2 or 3 different bands and, formats for your art. You may never produce anything that way.
Yeah. There's no shortage of those. I don't even want to call them characters, but people who read like characters, tragic heroes. I guess you don't want to say live like this person, but at the same time you. And there is a tragic arc to the way their lives would end, but at the same time, almost maybe it could be misguided, but a sense of envy that they lived as fully as they did, or you can at least say that they weren't dabbling; they were really going for it in some maybe.
Yeah, they produced something and a body of work, and it's not like anybody else's. I had all these tapes of live shows, and then the Toiling Midgets were being put together for compiled of missing tracks and stuff. And there were these new Ricky Williams vocals to put together on that WFMU show that I did, and that got for at that point in New York and that area, and John Allen's show, it really got response. It got noticed in San Francisco and in New York, and whoever listens to his show online. I was glad for that, because you tend to think, well, who remembers Ricky at this point? I think he and Will were, Will was in the one Rolling Stone article about, the new underground, where they did an article about Black Flag and Flipper and the Minutemen and Husker Du and, I don't know, maybe Replacements or somebody. And but they
85 I think, so already
at that point they did that article, but I don't think Ricky had ever been in Rolling Stone until his obituary, and that to me is just a signal, a sign of the rot in the culture. Is you don't appear in Rolling Stone until you're dead. When you've done what Ricky Williams did, when you were that good. And, he wasn't a workaholic. So maybe he could have worked his way into better press. But, you know, the fact that Rolling Stone came out of San Francisco and they didn't pay the slightest attention to what happened after they left town, and it just tells you Jan Wenner wanted to be media. He didn't want to be music.
Thank you again to Joe Carducci for appearing on this episode, and thank you for listening. For more on Joe Carducci's books, go to nightheron.square.site, and for more on Who Cares Anyway, go to headpress.com.
It was cold, I could see my breath. The light was blue and bare, and dancing up on the hooks, everyone was hanging there. They moved so slow they moved. They got no reason to hurry, 'cause they're not going anywhere. I just got back from the meat house. I took a look into the meat house. They got our lovers hanging there.